I spent a week on a farm with the owner's son. If you'd asked me a month earlier whether I'd ever voluntarily spend 7 days on a farm in the middle of nowhere, I would have laughed. I'm a city person. I like sidewalks, cafes on every corner, grocery stores that stay open until midnight, and internet fast enough to stream anything without buffering. A farm sounded like the exact opposite of everything I enjoyed. Yet there I was, dragging my suitcase across uneven gravel while trying not to step into puddles left behind by an early morning rain. The place was bigger than I'd imagined. Not one of those picturesque little hobby farms you see on Instagram. This was a real working farm. Red barns with faded paint. Endless fields stretching toward the horizon. Fences that looked older than I was. Tractors parked beside giant stacks of hay. Chickens wandering wherever they pleased as if they owned the place. Maybe they did. My uncle had arranged the whole thing. He worked with a family friend who owned the property and thought I might enjoy a different pace of life after spending months complaining about university stress. I never said I wanted manual labor. I only said I needed a break. Apparently, those meant the same thing to adults over 50. The front door opened before I even reached the porch. A tall man in his 50s stepped outside, wiping his hands on a towel. "You must be Christopher." "Yeah." He smiled warmly and held out his hand. "I'm Robert. Glad you made it." His handshake was firm enough to remind me I definitely wasn't in the city anymore. "Thanks for having me." "No problem. Your uncle's helped me out plenty over the years." He looked over my shoulder toward the driveway. "Joshua." His voice carried across the entire yard. A second later, someone answered from behind the barn. "Yeah. Come help Christopher with his bag." I turned instinctively. At first, I only saw movement between the buildings. Then someone stepped into view. Tall, dark blonde hair, old jeans, faded gray t-shirt, work gloves shoved into one back pocket. He couldn't have been much older than me. 22 maybe. He walked toward us without hurrying, wiping dirt from his hands onto his jeans before stopping a few feet away. "This him?" Robert nodded. "Christopher, this is my son, Joshua." Joshua gave me a brief nod. "Hey." "Hi." That was it. No smile. No excitement. Just one word before he picked up my suitcase like it weighed nothing and headed inside. I exchanged a quick glance with Robert. He's not much of a talker until he's had lunch. I laughed politely. I'll remember that. Inside, the farmhouse was surprisingly cozy. Wooden floors. Family photos covering almost every wall. A huge kitchen that looked like people actually cooked in it instead of just reheating frozen food. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the hallway. Someone had baked that morning. "You'll be upstairs." Robert led me toward a staircase while Joshua disappeared somewhere without another word. The room's simple, but it'll do. Simple was an understatement. A bed, a wooden dresser, a desk beside the window. No television. No decorations except faded blue curtains. Still, the view made up for everything. The window overlooked the fields, where sunlight had finally broken through the clouds. The entire landscape glowed gold. "You'll eat with us," Robert said. "Breakfast at 7. 7. I hadn't willingly seen 7 in the morning since high school. "I'll try." He laughed. "You'll be awake." Somehow that sounded less like encouragement and more like a promise. After unpacking, I wandered outside, mostly because there wasn't much else to do. No nearby town. No cafes. Almost no phone signal. Just fields. Animals. Wind. I found Joshua repairing part of a fence behind one of the barns. He glanced up briefly when he heard footsteps. "You settling in?" It surprised me that he started the conversation. "I think so." He hammered another nail into place. "You've never done farm work before." It wasn't a question. "No." I figured. "Is it that obvious?" "You packed white sneakers." I looked down. He wasn't wrong. They were already covered in mud. I noticed. He smiled. Barely. It disappeared almost immediately, but I'd seen it. "I've got an old pair of boots somewhere if you need them." "Seriously? Unless you plan on buying new shoes every day." "I'd appreciate it." He nodded once. "I'll find them later." Silence settled again. Not awkward exactly. Just unfamiliar. The countryside had a different kind of quiet. In the city, silence usually meant something had gone wrong. Here it simply existed. The wind moved through tall grass. Birds called somewhere beyond the fields. A tractor hummed faintly in the distance. Joshua finally stood, stretching his back. "You hungry?" "A little. Dad's probably finishing lunch." He started walking toward the house. I followed. Inside, lunch was loud despite there being only 3 of us. mostly because Robert talked enough for everyone. He asked about university, about where I'd grown up, about whether I'd ever ridden a horse. I haven't. Joshua looked up from his plate. You don't have to. I blinked. I wasn't planning to. Dad asks everybody. Robert grinned, still hoping someone says yes. I'm not volunteering. Didn't think you would. The conversation drifted naturally after that. It felt comfortable, easier than I'd expected. Joshua still didn't speak much, but whenever he did, it was usually something dry enough to make both of us laugh. By evening, I'd learned more about the farm than I ever expected to know. They grew wheat, raised chickens, kept a handful of horses, had been living there for generations. Joshua had gone away for university for one semester. Then he'd come back. Didn't like the city? I asked while we carried empty dishes into the kitchen. He shrugged. It never felt like home. You never wondered what you were missing. I did. And I came back anyway. There wasn't bitterness in his voice, just certainty. That surprised me. I'd spent years trying to leave my hometown. He'd chosen to return to his. That night I stood outside before going to bed. The stars were unbelievable. Thousands of them. I'd forgotten the sky could look like that without city lights. Joshua stepped onto the porch carrying 2 mugs. Tea. I accepted one. Thanks. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. We simply looked upward. Finally, I said quietly, I didn't realize nights could be this bright. He looked at me instead of the sky. You notice things out here? I guess. No. His voice stayed calm. You really do. The wind shifted through the trees. For some reason, neither of us moved. Then Robert opened the screen door behind us. You boys planning to sleep out here? Joshua answered without looking away from the fields. No. You've got chores at 7. He sighed dramatically. There it is. I laughed. What? The reminder. Robert smiled. Welcome to farm life. I had absolutely no idea then that the next 7 days would become the most unforgettable week of my life. The next morning, I woke to the sound of someone knocking on my door. Not politely. 3 sharp knocks. Christopher. Joshua's voice. You've got 5 minutes. I looked at the clock. 6:52. You people actually wake up before sunrise? I'll take that as you're awake. Footsteps moved away. I groaned into my pillow. Back home, 7 in the morning meant I'd probably gone to bed an hour earlier. Here, apparently, it was considered sleeping in. By the time I stumbled downstairs wearing borrowed boots and yesterday's hoodie, Robert already had coffee in one hand and toast in the other. Joshua looked completely awake. How? It wasn't fair. You'll adjust, Robert said, noticing my expression. I don't think I will. Joshua hid a smile behind his coffee mug. You say that now. Breakfast disappeared quickly. Apparently meals on a farm weren't long conversations. People actually had things to do. Robert left first. I'll be over in the east field. Joshua stood, grabbing another piece of toast. Christopher's with me today. Robert looked relieved. Good. Good. That sounded suspicious. Outside, the air was cool enough that I wished I'd brought another jacket. Joshua tossed me a pair of work gloves. You'll need these. What exactly are we doing? Depends. That's not an answer. It will be in about 5 minutes. We crossed the yard toward another fence running beside one of the fields. Halfway there he stopped. You've never carried hay? No. Driven a tractor? No. Fixed fencing? No. He looked genuinely thoughtful. So you've basically paid people your whole life. I've bought groceries. He laughed. An actual laugh this time. Not loud, but real. You really are a city kid. I'm beginning to feel judged. I haven't even started. For the next 2 hours, I discovered muscles I didn't know existed. Fence posts were heavier than they looked. Wire refused to cooperate. Everything involved lifting something, or pulling something, or carrying something farther than seemed necessary. By 10 in the morning, I was sweating despite the cool weather. Joshua, meanwhile, looked exactly the same. Not tired, not frustrated, just steady. You okay? I think my arms are falling off. They're still attached. Barely. He leaned against the fence. Take 5. I love those words. You've earned them. I sat on an overturned bucket while catching my breath. Joshua handed me a bottle of water. You don't have to prove anything. I know. You keep trying. I don't like feeling useless. He considered that. You're not useless. I've spent an hour handing you tools. And doing it right. I looked at him skeptically. That's your encouragement? I'm working on it. Another small smile. There it was again. The version of Joshua that appeared for only a second before disappearing behind his usual calm expression. By lunchtime, we'd finished repairing almost 30 feet of fencing. I felt strangely proud of that, even if most of my contribution had been carrying things. After eating, Robert headed into town for supplies. Joshua stayed behind. Dad won't be back until evening, so we're in charge. Pretty much. That sounds dangerous. For you, maybe. He grabbed 2 empty buckets. Come on. Where now? The horses. I thought you said I didn't have to ride one. You don't. He handed me a brush. You just have to survive cleaning them. The stable smelled exactly like every stable I'd ever imagined. Hey, leather. Animals. One of the horses pushed its nose against Joshua's shoulder the moment we walked inside. You've got fans. This one's Oliver. Joshua scratched behind the horse's ears. He thinks food solves every problem. I respect that. Joshua smiled. You two might get along. He showed me how to brush the horse slowly. Oliver stood perfectly still, every now and then nudging one of us if we stopped. He likes attention. So do you. The words slipped out before I thought about them. Joshua looked at me. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly asked, "What makes you think that?" I shrugged. You pretend you don't. But every time your dad compliments something you've done. I hesitated. You notice. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not defensive, just surprised. I never said anything. You didn't have to. He looked away toward Oliver. My mom used to notice things like that. Used to. The words hung in the air. I immediately realized what they meant. I'm sorry. Joshua kept brushing the horse. She passed away 4 years ago. I didn't know. Most people here do. But not me. No. Silence settled again. Different this time. Quieter. I almost mentioned her yesterday. He spoke so softly I nearly missed it. Then I remembered. I'm sorry. He nodded once. It gets easier. He didn't sound convinced. Neither was I. Later that afternoon, we walked along the edge of one of the fields checking irrigation pipes. There wasn't much to do. Mostly looking, talking, or simply walking beside each other. So, Joshua kicked a small stone off the path. Tell me something. About what? You. That's broad. I've got time. I thought for a moment. I've changed majors twice. Why? I couldn't decide what I wanted. And now, I'm studying architecture. You like it? I think so. He laughed quietly. You always answer with I think. I do. You've done it 6 times today. I wasn't counting. I was. I looked at him. You notice everything. So do you. Maybe he was right. Because I had started noticing things too. The way he always pushed open gates before I reached them. How every animal on the farm somehow trusted him immediately. How he rarely spoke first, but listened to every word someone else said. Most of all, how peaceful he looked out here. I'd never met anyone who fit so naturally into the place they lived. Near sunset, we climbed onto the roof of one of the barns. Apparently, that wasn't unusual. Joshua carried 2 bottles of lemonade with him. The best views up here. He wasn't exaggerating. The fields stretched endlessly beneath us. Golden wheat moved like waves whenever the wind crossed it. The sun hung low over the horizon. Everything turned orange. You come up here often? Whenever I need to think. What do you think about? He smiled without looking at me. Depends. On the company. I wasn't sure what to say to that. Instead, I watched the sunset. After several quiet minutes, he asked, "Do you miss the city?" I expected the answer to be immediate. Instead, I found myself thinking, I miss good coffee. He laughed. I knew it. I miss decent internet. Fair. I looked across the fields again. But, I don't miss as much as I expected. Joshua looked toward me. You're slowing down. What? You've checked your phone twice all day. Had I? I guess I have. Yesterday, it was every 5 minutes. I laughed. Was it really? You notice things. I rolled my eyes. Don't start. I'm just saying. The breeze picked up again. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Joshua quietly said, You know? What? I wasn't excited when Dad told me someone was coming. Ouch. I figured you'd complain. I have complained. Exactly. I nudged his shoulder lightly. You're impossible. But. He looked at me again. I'm glad you came. The words were simple, matter of fact. But something about the way he said them stayed with me long after we climbed down from that roof. That night, lying in bed with sore muscles and aching shoulders, I realized something strange. Only 2 days had passed, yet it already felt like I'd been there much longer. And for the first time in months, I fell asleep without checking my phone. On the 3rd morning, I woke up before Joshua knocked. That surprised me almost as much as it surprised him. When he opened the door exactly at 7, I was already pulling on my boots. He stopped in the doorway. "You're awake. I hate that you sound impressed." "I am. I think I've officially become one of you." He shook his head. "Let's not get carried away." We walked downstairs together. Robert glanced between us before smiling into his coffee. I was wondering how long it'd take. "What? You don't look miserable anymore." "I still feel miserable." Joshua snorted. "He's lying." "I am not. You smiled before breakfast." "I did no such thing." "You absolutely did." Robert chuckled. "I've got witnesses now." I rolled my eyes dramatically. This place is turning against me. After breakfast, Robert headed to another field with 2 seasonal workers who had arrived early that morning. Joshua looked toward the truck. "We're taking the north road." "Why?" "Fence inspection." "That sounds boring." "It is." "So why are you smiling?" "Because we're stopping at the lake." "The farm has a lake." "It does." "You never mentioned that." "You never asked." The truck bounced over narrow dirt roads lined with trees. The farther we drove, the quieter everything became. Eventually, the fields gave way to woodland. Then, suddenly, the trees opened. A lake stretched out before us, perfectly still beneath the morning sun. I actually stopped walking. I had no idea this was here. Most people don't. The water reflected the sky so perfectly it almost looked unreal. There wasn't another person anywhere. Just birds, wind, and silence. Joshua leaned against the old wooden fence surrounding part of the shore. "When I was little, Mom used to bring sandwiches here." I looked at him. He wasn't looking at me, just at the water. "She said every place needs somewhere people forget to hurry." I smiled softly. "She sounds nice." She was. He skipped a small stone across the lake. It bounced 3 times. "I still come here when everything gets too loud." "It doesn't seem very loud around here." He smiled faintly. "It is inside your own head." That answer stayed with me. We spent almost an hour walking around the shoreline before finally inspecting the old fencing nearby. Work somehow felt easier there, mostly because every few minutes I found myself staring back at the water. "You've stopped checking your phone." Joshua said it casually. "No signal." "That's not why." I looked at him. "I think." He adjusted another loose board. "You're finally paying attention." Maybe he was right, because I'd started noticing ridiculous things. How different the wind sounded depending on which trees it passed through. How the smell of grass changed after the sun warmed it. How Joshua unconsciously hummed whenever he concentrated. "You do that." He looked up. "Do what?" "Hum." "I don't." "You absolutely do." "I've never noticed." "I have." He stared at me for a second, then quietly smiled. "So now you're counting things too." I learned from the best. By lunchtime, we'd finished everything Robert had asked us to do. Instead of heading home immediately, Joshua stopped beside the lake again. "You hungry?" I could eat. He reached into the truck. I figured. Inside was a cooler. Sandwiches. Fruit. Cold lemonade. "You planned this." Dad always packs extra. We sat on an old wooden dock with our feet dangling above the water. It felt strange how comfortable the silence had become. Back home, silence usually meant 2 people had run out of things to say. With Joshua, it simply meant neither of us needed to fill the space. Halfway through lunch, he suddenly asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "You've dated much?" The question caught me off guard. "A little." "What does a little mean?" "Nothing serious." He nodded. "I've been on exactly 1 date." "Only 1. It wasn't great." "What happened?" He laughed awkwardly. "We spent 2 hours realizing we had absolutely nothing in common." "What did you talk about?" "Cows." I blinked. "Cows?" "She raised cattle." "And?" "I don't." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my sandwich. "You're making that up." "I'm not." "There's no way." "I swear." We both laughed for nearly a minute. When the laughter faded, Joshua looked out across the water. "I don't meet many new people." I noticed. "Most days it's just Dad. And the chickens. They're terrible conversationalists." I suspected. He glanced sideways. "What about you?" "What about me?" "You probably meet hundreds of people." "I do. But I don't actually know most of them." He looked thoughtful. "The city's funny." "How?" "So many people." He gestured vaguely. "And everyone seems alone." I couldn't argue, because he wasn't wrong. On the drive back, clouds slowly gathered overhead. By late afternoon, thunder rolled somewhere in the distance. "We should hurry." Joshua's tone changed immediately. The relaxed conversation disappeared. Within minutes, we were loading equipment into the barn before the storm reached us. Rain arrived all at once. Heavy, loud. The barn roof echoed beneath it. We stood just inside the doorway watching sheets of rain swallow the fields. I guess we're stuck. Joshua nodded. For a while, lightning flashed across the sky. Seconds later, thunder shook the building. I looked out at the storm. I've never seen rain like this. It moves fast here. The barn suddenly felt much darker. Rain drummed endlessly overhead. Neither of us spoke. Then Joshua disappeared toward one corner of the barn. What are you doing? He came back carrying an old wooden box. Inside were faded photographs. My mom kept these out here. He handed one to me. A younger Robert. A woman with Joshua's eyes. And a boy who couldn't have been older than 10, covered in mud from head to toe while holding an impossibly small puppy. I smiled immediately. That's you. I was having a very bad day. It doesn't look like it. I'd just fallen into a ditch. You were smiling. Because Mom laughed before helping me out. I studied the photograph. She looked happy. The kind of smile people have when they're completely at home. You look like her. Joshua was quiet. I've heard that. It's true. He carefully took the picture back. She would have liked you. The words came so unexpectedly that I didn't answer immediately. You barely know me. I know enough. How? He shrugged. You listen. Rain continued pounding against the roof. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt unusually honest. By the time the storm passed, evening light had returned. Everything outside smelled fresh. The fields sparkled beneath thousands of tiny drops of water. As we walked back toward the house, Joshua suddenly slowed. You know? What? I usually don't tell people about Mom. You don't have to. I know. He looked ahead instead of at me. I wanted to. Something warm settled quietly in my chest. Not because of what he'd said, because of how naturally he'd trusted me with it. That evening, after dinner, Robert disappeared into his office to finish paperwork. Joshua and I stayed outside on the porch. The air smelled like rain and wet earth. Fireflies drifted above the grass. I didn't know they were real. Joshua looked amused. You thought movies invented them? I've never actually seen one. He stood. Come here. I followed him into the yard. One tiny light floated lazily between us. Then another. And another. Within minutes, dozens of fireflies blinked across the field. It felt unreal. Like tiny stars had drifted down into the grass. They're beautiful. Joshua nodded. They only stay for a little while. We stood shoulder to shoulder watching them. Neither of us noticed how close we'd ended up standing. Not until our hands brushed accidentally. We both looked down at exactly the same moment. Then quietly stepped half a pace apart. Neither of us apologized. Neither of us mentioned it. But somehow, the silence after that felt completely different. The fourth day started differently. Not because of the work. Because I was beginning to recognize the sounds of the farm. The rooster before sunrise. The old tractor starting somewhere behind the barn. The screen door creaking downstairs. Joshua whistling softly while feeding the chickens. 3 days earlier, all of it had felt foreign. Now it simply meant morning. I walked downstairs to find Robert already reading the local newspaper. He lowered it just enough to look at me. You've got color. What? You were pale when you arrived. Joshua glanced up from making coffee. Dad says that to everyone who's been indoors too long. I'm serious. I know. Robert smiled. Fresh air fixes things. I'm pretty sure fresh air also caused every muscle in my body to hurt. Joshua slid a mug toward me. It gets better. You've been saying that since Monday. And it hasn't. He laughed. Give it another day. After breakfast, Robert announced he had to spend most of the afternoon meeting suppliers in town. You two can handle the western fields? Joshua nodded immediately. We'll be fine. Robert pointed a finger at him. And don't forget the old orchard. I won't. Once Robert drove away, I looked toward Joshua. So, what exactly is in the old orchard? You'll see. Whenever he answered like that, it usually meant he was enjoying himself. 20 minutes later, we walked through another section of the property I'd never seen before. Rows of old apple trees stretched across a gentle hill. Many looked older than the farmhouse itself. This is incredible. Joshua reached up, checking one of the branches. My grandfather planted most of these. How old are they? Some are almost 60 years old. He moved naturally between the trees, stopping every few minutes to inspect fruit or trim small branches. What do I do? Follow me. So you don't get lost. I wouldn't. He raised an eyebrow. You walked into the chicken pen yesterday. That was one time. You followed a goose. I thought it knew where it was going. It was a goose. It looked confident. Joshua laughed so suddenly he had to stop walking. I can't believe you admitted that. I stand by my decision. No, you don't. I absolutely don't. He shook his head. You really don't belong out here. And yet, I looked around the orchard. I'm starting to like it. His smile faded into something softer. I noticed. The work itself was simple. Collect damaged fruit. Trim broken branches. Clear weeds growing around the older trees. Nothing difficult. Mostly it gave us an excuse to spend several hours talking. Or listening. Sometimes one. Sometimes the other. At one point Joshua climbed halfway up an old wooden ladder. Without thinking, I stepped forward to hold it steady. He glanced down. You don't have to. I know. But I'd rather not explain to your dad how you fell out of a tree. I've climbed these since I was 6. I've known you 4 days. So I'm still holding the ladder. He looked at me for a moment, then quietly said, okay. When he climbed back down, neither of us mentioned it again. Around noon the heat became almost unbearable. Joshua wiped sweat from his forehead. We're taking a break. I support this decision. He led me farther into the orchard. Behind the last row of trees stood an old wooden swing, hanging from an enormous oak. I stopped. That's been here forever. My grandfather built it. Joshua sat down first. It creaked gently beneath his weight. You use this? Sometimes. I sat beside him. The swing moved slowly. Branches overhead filtered the sunlight into shifting patterns across the grass. This feels like another world. It kind of is. He leaned back. When I was little, he looked up through the leaves. Mom used to read here. Books. Mostly novels. You like listening? I pretended I didn't. But you did. He smiled. Yeah. I could almost picture it. A younger Joshua. His mother reading aloud beneath the same tree. Summer afternoons stretching endlessly ahead. You miss her every day. It wasn't really a question. He didn't answer immediately. No. I looked toward him. No. I don't miss her every day. He watched sunlight moving across the grass. Some days I forget. His voice stayed calm. And then I remember that I forgot. I understood exactly what he meant, even though I'd never experienced it myself. That's the part that hurts. I nodded quietly. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The swing moved gently back and forth. Birds sang somewhere high above us. Eventually Joshua looked toward me. I haven't talked about her this much in years. You don't have to explain why. I'm not explaining. He smiled faintly. I'm thanking you. For what? For listening without trying to fix anything. I laughed softly. I wouldn't even know where to start. Exactly. That afternoon we finished work earlier than expected. Instead of heading directly home, Joshua stopped outside an old equipment shed. Come here. He disappeared inside. A moment later he rolled out 2 bicycles. One looked almost new. The other looked like it had survived several decades. I called the newer one. He tossed me the older bike. I figured, you'll survive. I'm not convinced. 10 minutes later we were riding along narrow dirt paths cutting through the fields. The wind rushed past us. Golden wheat stretched endlessly on both sides. Joshua stayed several yards ahead before turning around. You okay back there? I think my bicycle predates electricity. It definitely does. It squeaks. It always has. You could have warned me. I wanted to see your face. I laughed despite myself. You planned this. A little. By the time we reached another hill overlooking the farm, both of us were out of breath. We laid the bikes down in the grass. The farmhouse looked tiny from there. So that's everything. Joshua pointed across the landscape. The barns. The fields. The orchard. The lake. My entire world. I looked across everything he'd just shown me. Do you ever wonder what life would have been like somewhere else? He thought about it. Sometimes. And I always end up here. You really love this place. I do. He looked toward me. What about you? I've spent years trying to find somewhere that feels right. And I haven't yet. Joshua studied my face longer than usual. You might. I hope so. I think people spend too much time looking for places. What should they look for? He smiled almost shyly. The people who make a place feel different. The sentence landed somewhere deep inside me. Neither of us said anything afterward, because neither of us needed to. On the ride back, clouds drifted lazily across the afternoon sky. Everything felt slower, lighter. When we reached the farmhouse, Robert's truck was already parked outside. He was sitting on the porch with 2 glasses of iced tea waiting for us. There you are. Joshua leaned his bicycle against the fence. We got everything done. I know. Robert smiled knowingly. I drove past the orchard. Joshua looked guilty for exactly half a second. We took a break. For almost 2 hours. I tried not to laugh. Robert shook his head. I remember being 22. Joshua rubbed the back of his neck. We finished the work. I noticed. Robert looked toward me. So, yeah. How's farm life treating you now? I looked around instinctively. The porch. The fields. Joshua quietly putting the bicycles away. The evening sun settling over everything. Then I answered honestly. I don't think I want the week to end. I hadn't planned to say it out loud. Joshua paused for the briefest moment before continuing toward the barn. He didn't turn around, but I saw him smile. The 5th morning felt different before I even opened my eyes. Maybe it was because I knew there were only 3 days left. Or maybe because I'd stopped thinking of the farmhouse as somewhere I was staying. For the first time, it felt like somewhere I belonged. That realization caught me off guard. I found Joshua outside before breakfast, sitting on the porch steps with an old border collie asleep beside him. I didn't know you had a dog. He looked down at the sleepy bundle of fur. His name's Murphy. Murphy opened one eye, decided I wasn't interesting enough to move for, and went back to sleep. I've never seen him. He sleeps most of the day. I respect him already. Joshua smiled. He'd respect you too. Because I sleep late? Because you're getting better at pretending you don't. We ate breakfast slowly that morning. Robert had nowhere urgent to be, so conversation wandered from weather forecasts to neighboring farms to stories about Joshua as a kid. I should warn you, Robert said, pointing his fork toward me. He used to disappear. Joshua groaned immediately. Dad, I'm serious. He wasn't. Robert ignored him. When he was 10, we'd spend hours looking for him. Joshua buried his face in his coffee. I already know where this is going. We'd search the barns, the fields, the creek, and every single time. Robert smiled triumphantly. He'd be asleep somewhere with a book. I looked at Joshua. You read? He looked offended. I can read. You know what I meant. I read. He reads constantly, Robert said. He just hides the books. Joshua sighed dramatically. I don't hide them. You absolutely do. I organize them. Under your bed. They fit. I laughed. I didn't expect that. Joshua looked at me. What exactly did you expect? I don't know. You thought I'd only own books about farming. I wasn't going to say it. But you thought it. Maybe. He shook his head. I'll show you later. After breakfast, Robert handed Joshua a list. I need supplies delivered to Mrs. Carter. Joshua glanced at it. We can do that. We. Robert smiled innocently. Christopher hasn't met anyone in town yet. I looked toward Joshua. You have a town? He looked offended. Of course we have a town. I pictured one gas station. We have two. Luxury. 40 minutes later, we were driving into the smallest town I'd ever visited. One main street. A bakery. A hardware store. A diner. A tiny grocery shop. Everyone seemed to know Joshua. People waved as we drove past. Someone shouted his name from across the street. An older woman walked out of the bakery carrying a paper bag. Joshua. He parked immediately. Morning, Mrs. Ellis. She barely acknowledged me before pinching Joshua's cheek. When are you finally cutting that hair? He sighed. Morning to you too. Only then did she notice me. Oh, her expression brightened. And who's this? Before I could answer, Joshua said simply, Christopher. She looked between us. The university friend? Joshua hesitated. Something like that. She smiled knowingly. Well, she handed him a bag. Take these cinnamon rolls before your father finds out I made extras. We won't tell him. You'd better not. Back in the truck, I looked sideways at Joshua. The university friend? He kept his eyes on the road. It was easier. Easier than what? He was quiet for several seconds. Explaining. I nodded slowly. Fair enough. But. He glanced toward me briefly. I wasn't embarrassed. I know. You didn't know what to call me. He smiled faintly. Exactly. We finished deliveries before noon. Instead of heading home immediately, Joshua parked outside a small bookstore squeezed between the bakery and the post office. You weren't joking. About books. He opened the door. Come on. Inside, the place smelled of old paper and wood polish. Books covered every wall from floor to ceiling. An elderly man looked up from behind the counter. Joshua. Morning. The old man smiled warmly. I've got the one you ordered. He disappeared into the back before returning with a wrapped hardcover novel. You order books here? Joshua nodded. Every month. I couldn't hide my surprise. He noticed immediately. What? I don't know. You expected farming magazines. I deserve that. You really do. The bookstore owner looked between us with obvious curiosity. You staying long? I answered. Just another few days. A shame. He smiled. This one's finally started talking. Joshua groaned. Mr. Bennett. What? You used to answer questions with one word. He looked at me. It drove your mother crazy too. The mention of her changed Joshua's expression for just a second. Mr. Bennett noticed immediately. So, he cleared his throat gently. You'll be taking this then? Joshua nodded. As we walked back outside carrying the book, I asked quietly, did he know your mom? He knew everyone. You come here a lot? Since I was 12. That's a long time. He smiled while running a hand across the book's cover. This place always felt quiet. It still does. I know. He looked toward me. I thought you'd like it. The words settled warmly inside me. Not because of the bookstore, because he'd thought of me. On the drive home, neither of us turned on the radio. The silence felt familiar now. Comfortable. After a while, Joshua suddenly asked, can I ask something weird? I'll decide after you ask. If you weren't leaving, I waited. What would you do? I looked out the window at endless fields sliding past. I don't know. No idea. I think. The answer surprised even me. I'd stay longer. Joshua's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the steering wheel. For real? Yeah. He smiled to himself. I was hoping you'd say that. When we got back to the farmhouse, the afternoon passed quietly. Robert disappeared into the machinery shed. Joshua headed upstairs after dinner. Remembering what Robert had said that morning, I knocked lightly on his bedroom door. Come in. His room looked nothing like I'd expected. Bookshelves, stacks of novels, maps pinned to one wall, a desk facing the window, more books under the bed exactly where Robert had said. I looked around slowly. So, Joshua leaned back in his chair. Still think I only read farming magazines? I owe you an apology. You do. I picked up one of the novels. You've read all of these? Most of them twice. I smiled. I don't think I know you as well as I thought. Joshua looked at me quietly. I don't think many people do. Our eyes met. Neither of us looked away. The room suddenly felt much smaller than it actually was. Not uncomfortable, just quieter. After a long moment, Joshua spoke. Christopher. Yeah. I'm glad Dad invited you. I smiled. I'm glad he did too. He nodded slowly. So am I. Outside, somewhere beyond the window, the evening breeze moved gently through the wheat fields. Inside, neither of us reached for another book. Neither of us seemed to want the conversation to end. Because without saying it aloud, we had both started noticing the same thing. There were only 2 days left. The 6th morning arrived too quickly. I realized that before I even opened my eyes. 5 days earlier, I'd been counting the hours until I could go home. Now I was counting how few were left. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I found Joshua sitting on the porch again, this time with a notebook balanced on one knee. He closed it almost immediately when he saw me. Morning. You were writing? No. I pointed toward the notebook. I literally saw you. I was making a list. That looked suspiciously like writing. It was. So you lied. I changed my mind. I laughed. I've noticed something. What's that? You hate admitting people are right. He stood, slipping the notebook into his jacket pocket. Let's eat. Nice subject change. Thank you. Robert was already pouring coffee. You boys are heading into the south pasture today. Joshua nodded. I know. And before you ask, Robert looked at me. It's mostly walking. I suddenly love the south pasture. Joshua smiled into his coffee. You'll regret saying that. An hour later, we were crossing another section of the farm I'd never explored. The grass reached almost to my knees. Wildflowers covered parts of the hillside. In the distance, a small stream cut across the land before disappearing into another line of trees. This place is enormous. Joshua nodded. When I was little, I thought it never ended. And now, I know where it ends. He smiled. I just don't always want to. The morning passed slowly. We checked fences, counted livestock, made notes for Robert. Nothing difficult. Mostly walking beneath a bright blue sky. Around noon, we reached the stream. Joshua crouched near the water, filling 2 bottles. I sat on a large flat rock nearby. This is probably the quietest place I've ever been. You've said that about 3 different places already. I know. They're all true. He handed me a bottle. I used to skip school here. I looked up. You skipped school. Twice. You're such a rebel. I know. What happened? My mom found out. Ouch. She made me spend the afternoon pulling weeds. I laughed. Did it work? I never skipped again. Effective. He smiled. Very. For a while we simply listened to the water flowing over smooth stones. Eventually I noticed something. You've stopped asking me about the city. He looked over. I guess I have. Why? He thought about it. Because you don't talk about it much anymore. He was right. I hadn't realized that. Instead of talking about my apartment, or university, or traffic, I'd started asking questions about wheat, about horses, about weather. Somehow those things had become more interesting. You're smiling again. Joshua interrupted my thoughts. I am. You've been doing that a lot. I blame the farm. You should. He looked away toward the stream. It likes keeping people. The sentence felt strangely personal. Before I could answer, Murphy came running through the grass toward us. The old border collie skidded to a stop beside Joshua, carrying a stick almost as long as he was. You followed us. Joshua scratched behind the dog's ears. Murphy immediately dropped the stick at my feet. I think he wants you. I've known him less than a week. He likes you. I don't know why. Joshua smiled. Neither does he. Murphy barked once, impatiently. I picked up the stick. You seriously want me to throw this? The dog wagged his tail so hard his entire body moved. I threw it. Badly. The stick landed only a few yards away. Murphy sprinted after it as though I'd launched it across the country. Joshua laughed. He's very encouraging. He has low standards. He's lived with me his whole life. That explains everything. By the time we returned to the farmhouse that afternoon, the sky had begun turning gold again. Every sunset somehow seemed prettier than the last. Robert was repairing an old gate. You two done already? Joshua nodded. Everything's checked. Robert leaned on the fence. Good. He looked toward me. Christopher. Yeah. You leaving tomorrow morning? The question hit harder than I expected. I guess so. You don't sound happy about it. I wasn't. I've had a good week. Robert smiled knowingly. So I've noticed. He picked up his tools again. Joshua. Yeah. Show him the hill tonight. Joshua paused. I was planning to. Robert looked satisfied. Good. I waited until we were walking away. What's the hill? You'll see. Again with that. He only smiled. After dinner, as the sun slowly approached the horizon, Joshua grabbed 2 blankets from the hallway. Come on. We climbed a narrow path behind the orchard. Eventually, we reached the highest point on the entire property. The view stole my breath. Every field glowed beneath the evening light. The barns looked tiny. The farmhouse seemed almost hidden among the trees. Far beyond everything else, I could just make out the lake reflecting the orange sky. This. I couldn't finish the sentence. Joshua spread one blanket across the grass. Is where Mom used to bring us on the last warm evening of every summer. I sat beside him. It feels. I searched for the right word. Important. It is. We watched the sun slowly sink toward the horizon. Neither of us spoke. Eventually, Joshua broke the silence. Can I tell you something? Always. He took a slow breath. When Dad told me someone from the city was staying here, he smiled to himself. I spent 2 days trying to think of excuses to avoid you. I laughed. I believe that. I thought you'd complain. I did complain. I know. I also thought you'd hate waking up early. I hated waking up early. And I figured you'd spend every minute looking at your phone. I definitely started that way. He nodded. You surprised me. I looked toward him. How? You actually paid attention. To what? Everything. The wind moved gently through the tall grass around us. You asked about the farm. My mom. The books. The orchard. He looked down at his hands. Most people don't. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked quietly, can I tell you something too? He nodded. When my uncle suggested this trip, I laughed softly. I almost said no. Joshua smiled. I'm glad you didn't. So am I. Another silence settled between us. This one felt different. More fragile. The sun slipped lower. Everything around us turned deep orange. I've been thinking. Joshua's voice was almost lost in the wind. About. You leave tomorrow. Yeah. I don't like that. Neither did I. But hearing him say it aloud made something tighten inside my chest. I don't either. He looked toward me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Neither of us looked away. Then Joshua smiled sadly. I guess 1 week goes by pretty fast. It really does. The last edge of the sun disappeared below the horizon. The first stars slowly appeared overhead. Somehow, sitting there beside him, I wished the evening would never end. I barely slept that night. Not because the bed was uncomfortable, not because of the silence, because I kept thinking about tomorrow. Every hour that passed felt like something slipping away before I'd figured out how to hold on to it. When morning finally arrived, the house was quieter than usual. My suitcase stood beside the bedroom door, already packed. Seeing it there made everything feel suddenly real. Downstairs, Robert was making pancakes. Special occasion, he said when he noticed me looking. I thought breakfast deserved an upgrade. Joshua appeared a minute later, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. Neither of us mentioned that it was my last morning. We didn't need to. It hung quietly over the entire table. Breakfast lasted longer than usual. Robert told another embarrassing story about Joshua accidentally locking himself inside the chicken coop when he was 13. Joshua protested. I laughed harder than I probably should have. For a little while, everything felt normal. When the dishes were finally washed, Robert checked his watch. I've got to drive into town before lunch. He looked toward Joshua. Can you give Christopher a ride later? Joshua nodded. I will. Robert walked over and squeezed my shoulder. It was good having you here. Thank you for letting me stay. No. He smiled warmly. Thank you for reminding this place what laughter sounds like. Before I could answer, he picked up his truck keys. I'll be back this afternoon. The sound of the engine faded down the long dirt road. Then it was just the two of us. The farmhouse suddenly felt much bigger. Neither of us seemed to know what to say. Finally, Joshua broke the silence. Come with me. We walked without talking. Past the barn. Past the orchard. Past the old swing. Eventually, we reached the lake. The water was perfectly still, just like the first time he brought me there. He leaned against the same wooden fence. I figured. He looked across the water. This should probably be the last place. I stood beside him. I was hoping you'd say that. The breeze moved gently across the surface of the lake. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Joshua quietly asked, Are you going to forget this place? I turned toward him. No. I mean after a few months. No. After a year? I smiled. I don't think I'll ever forget it. He nodded slowly. Good. What about you? I've lived here my whole life. That's not what I asked. He laughed softly. No. His voice was almost lost in the wind. I won't forget this week. The honesty in his answer settled somewhere deep inside me. I looked back across the lake. I didn't expect. I searched for the right words. Any of this. Neither did I. I thought I'd spend 7 days counting the hours until I left. And instead, I laughed quietly. I'm wondering how to stay. He looked down at the grass. I've been wondering something too. What? What happens after today? The question had been sitting between us since yesterday. Neither of us had wanted to ask it. I don't know. You'll go back. Yeah. I'll still be here. Yeah. Silence. Real silence. The kind that comes when there isn't an easy answer. Finally, I spoke. You're only 3 hours away. He looked at me. That's true. And phones actually work in cities. They do. I could come back. His eyes searched my face. You'd want to? I think. I smiled. I'm done saying I think. He laughed. I noticed. I want to. The words felt surprisingly easy once I said them. I want to come back. His shoulders relaxed in a way I'd never seen before. I'd like that. So would I. Another breeze crossed the lake. Then Joshua reached into his jacket. The notebook. I blinked. What? The one you caught me writing in. He pulled it out and handed it to me. You can read it. I looked uncertain. Are you sure? He nodded. The notebook wasn't full. Only a handful of pages had been written. Most contained sketches of the farm, the orchard, the barn, the lake. Between the drawings were short paragraphs, small observations, weather, work, random thoughts. Near the back, I found a newer page. The handwriting was neater than the others. It read, Dad was right. Sometimes someone arrives without changing the farm at all. They just remind you to look at it through different eyes. Christopher notices everything. He made me realize I'd stopped noticing some of it myself. I hope this isn't the last time he stands beside this lake. I looked up slowly. Joshua suddenly seemed fascinated by the water. I wasn't supposed to read that. You were. I don't know what to say. You don't have to. I closed the notebook carefully. I've got something to admit. He looked over. The first day, I smiled to myself. I thought you didn't like me. I know. You were impossible to read. I was nervous. You? I hadn't talked to anyone new in a long time. That somehow made perfect sense. I handed the notebook back. I'm really glad you talked to me. So am I. Neither of us moved. Neither of us seemed eager to leave. Eventually, Joshua looked toward the sky. We should probably go. Yeah. Neither of us did. He laughed quietly. We're not very good at goodbyes. I've noticed. So have I. When we finally walked back toward the farmhouse, my suitcase was already waiting beside the porch. Robert's truck had returned. He loaded everything into the back of my car while pretending not to notice how quiet we both were. Before getting in, I hugged him. Take care of yourself. You too. And don't wait another year before visiting. I won't. He smiled knowingly. I believe you. I turned toward Joshua. For a second, we simply looked at each other. 7 days. That was all. It somehow felt much longer. I'm terrible at this, I admitted. I know. He smiled. So am I. I laughed. Guess that makes 2 of us. He stepped forward. We hugged briefly. Nothing dramatic. Just long enough to say everything neither of us had found words for. When we stepped back, he reached into his pocket again. A folded piece of paper. Open it later. What is it? You'll see. I smiled. You really like saying that. I do. I climbed into the car. The engine started. I drove slowly down the gravel road. In the mirror, I could still see Robert standing on the porch. Joshua beside him, one hand raised. I waved back until the farmhouse disappeared behind the trees. 3 hours later, I stopped at a roadside cafe for coffee. Only then did I remember the folded paper. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sentence. Next time, stay longer. Beneath it was a phone number. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I smiled. Not because I suddenly knew what would happen next. I didn't. Life rarely gives perfect endings. But sometimes, it gives you something better. A reason to come back. As I pulled back onto the highway, my phone connected to the network for the first time all week. Messages flooded the screen. University group chats. Advertisements. Missed notifications. Without even reading them, I pressed one button. New contact. Joshua. A few seconds later, I sent my first message. Christopher, I already missed the lake. The reply came before I'd even reached the next intersection. Joshua, good. A pause. Then another message. Joshua, so do I. I smiled all the way home.